All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 16, The Era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. We'll be looking at Section 1, Restoring the Union. So this chapter is on the Era of Reconstruction. You can see that it goes from 1865 to 1877. In general, this is the time period after the Civil War. So last chapter, chapter 15, was entirely about the Civil War. This is essentially what goes on afterwards. And Reconstruction essentially refers to two things. It means, in some sense, really the physical rebuilding of the country, especially for the South, in which the war was more destructive in terms of like territory and infrastructure. But maybe more importantly, this is less about the actual physical rebuilding, but more about rebuilding the relationship between North and South. That is really, that's really what's at stake here, rebuilding the relationship between North, South, two parts of the country that just spent the past 4 years killing one another. So how do those two sides become essentially American again? One sort of united family in a sense. The era of Reconstruction is very important and very consequential. The Civil War itself more or less guaranteed two things. Maybe we'll just sort of take note of what those two things were. First was that the Union, or the country, would be preserved. That means the United States would not break apart. That was certainly a factor in the war. And another thing that was guaranteed was that slavery was abolished. Right? Those two things were very clear outcomes of the Civil War. However, there are a lot of sort of outstanding questions, and those questions are answered in this period of Reconstruction. So, for example, one of the questions is, well, what do you do with those rebels who waged war against the United States? Do you punish the rebels for what they did? Or do you forgive them because eventually they do have to be American again? What do you do with, for example, or what is the status of former slaves? Do slaves have the same rights as their white counterparts? What sort of role do they play in society economically now that slavery is abolished? All of these questions are answered in this period of Reconstruction. That's why it's very, very consequential. So again, Reconstruction, period after the Civil War. We might also add process by which former Confederate states re-enter, and I put kind of re-enter in quotes here because according to Abraham Lincoln, those states never left. They were simply in rebellion. Former states re-enter the Union. Essentially, what's going to be required is that all of them will be required to draft new constitutions that explicitly show that slavery is abolished. When it comes to Reconstruction, there are going to be a couple of plans. That is, sort of getting a little bit more at the details of this. What are the exact details by which these former states enter? 3 plans in total. The first one is the president's plan. To avoid any sort of confusion, because there's also another plan by a future president, we'll call this Lincoln's plan. Otherwise referred to as the 10% plan. 10% plan. So Lincoln, even before the war was over, had already began thinking about the process by which these former states would, quote unquote, re-enter into the Union. According to his plan, according to his plan, and this is what the 10% refers to, Lincoln required that 10% of the voting population take an oath of allegiance, right? So we might say the voting population, 10%. We'll just say 10% of voting population take an oath of allegiance. And that would be to the U.S., right? To the United States, to the North, right? Very explicitly, as opposed to the South. Also, Lincoln was more or less forgiving of most members of the Confederacy, except the highest-ranking Confederate leaders. So we might say the highest-ranking Confederate leaders would be excluded from, positions of, we'll just say, leadership in the government. So in other words, if somebody was a high-ranking member of the Confederacy, they would no longer be able to play a part in U.S. politics or the government. They had essentially lost that privilege. That was the punishment that they served. But for the most part, the rest of the population, soldiers, officers, other people who played a much lesser role in the Confederacy and in the Civil War Rebellion, they would be forgiven. And of course, a key component to this also was the emancipation of slavery, right? So there was an agreement that slavery must be abolished. And for the most part, in short, again, if a state agreed to all these things, so again, we're going to think about Reconstruction as being the process by which former states, Confederate states, re-enter the Union. If high-ranking leaders are excluded, if 10% of the population takes an oath of allegiance to the United States, and if that state writes, slavery is abolished in their state constitution, that would be good enough for President Lincoln to let that state back in the Union, right? In general, we would consider Lincoln's plan to be very lenient. That is, it wasn't very harsh, right? So Lincoln's plan was rather lenient, right? Not harsh. And, Lincoln was really focused on readmitting those southern states kind of as quickly and painlessly as possible. He really wanted to see the country come together in a way that, wasn't prolonged, for example. But not everybody was on board with Lincoln's plan. In fact, there were many members of his own political party that believed Lincoln was being too easy on the Confederacy. Those were the radical Republicans, right? Lincoln was a member of the Republican Party. So the radical Republicans want more, we'll say, punishment for the Confederacy. Again, one of the questions that we asked at the very beginning was, what to do with former rebels, right? What to do with the former Confederacy. There's a sense that on the one hand, they could be forgiven, and on the other hand, there could be retribution and punishment. Lincoln definitely is a little bit more on the side of forgiveness. And the radical Republicans on the North say, wait a minute, this is a group of people that waged war on our country for the better part of, 4 or 5 years. These are traitors, and they deserve some sort of punishment. And what Lincoln's doing is far too lenient, and we want something else. And so a couple of Northern or radical Republican Congress members, Wade and Davis, put together a bill that will be, we'll say this will be more harsh on former Confederates. One thing that it included was the ironclad oath, which was, a little bit more, you could say, in Lincoln's oath, initially it was just an oath of allegiance to the United States. The ironclad oath was requiring people to swear they had never supported the Confederacy, swear they had never supported the South, right? So it's a little bit different And I believe that the Wade-Davis bill also required a much larger number. I think 50% of the population had to take it, as opposed to only 10% in Lincoln's plan. So swear they had never supported the Confederacy. And, this is kind of a key difference in the way that some Northerners look at, the process of reuniting the country again. Punishment and retribution, or forgive and forget. Lincoln, didn't take action on this. When a bill gets passed by Congress, it goes to the president's desk. Typically they can do two things. That is, either sign it or veto it. But Lincoln did a third thing, and that was to do nothing. And sometimes we refer to this as a pocket veto. That means the president neither signs it nor rejects it. So not really taking a very strong stance. So Lincoln didn't endorse the Wade-Davis bill. At the very least, we could say that his inaction was kind of a non-support for that particular bill. So he did nothing, and eventually the Wade-Davis bill expired. However, though, Lincoln's plan and his vision for Reconstruction would never get fully realized. Just a couple of days after the Civil War concluded, John Wilkes Booth, a pro-Confederate, pro-Southerner, assassinated Lincoln. And with Lincoln's assassination, as you can see depicted in this image here, so too went Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. Lincoln's death was a tremendous shock to the nation. He is sometimes regarded as the last casualty of the Civil War. And he had provided, leadership for the country during its most vulnerable time. And for the most part, stepped up to the occasion and led Union forces to victory, preserving the Union and abolishing slavery, 2 in 1. And his assassination, was important for a lot of reasons. One is just that he was the first president ever in American history to be assassinated. But more importantly for us is that it really throws the process of Reconstruction into sort of a question mark, right? Here's a president who's provided leadership during the, think of it, captain of a ship during the toughest or most difficult storm, and then the captain's dead. Who's going to drive the ship? And that's really what's most consequential here anyways, because now this process of Reconstruction is essentially up for grabs. Prior to his assassination, however, Congress was working on the 13th Amendment. There are 3 Reconstruction Amendments to remember, so 3 plans, 3 amendments. The 13th Amendment would abolish slavery everywhere, right? Everywhere. And would make it much more formal. Recall that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was made during the war. It only abolished slavery in the states that were in rebellion, so border states, slave states that fought for the Union. Slavery was still technically legal there. And the 13th Amendment would be added to, the Constitution, making it, essentially written in stone, as opposed to some sort of law or some sort of executive order, right? The Constitution is the rule book, so it would be written there. And that was something that was in the process of being passed while Lincoln was still alive. I don't think that Lincoln even got to see the ratification of the 13th Amendment, that slavery was abolished everywhere. But the news of abolition didn't always travel so quickly in those days. Recall that with the Emancipation Proclamation, it pretty much meant that where Union or Northern soldiers went, that's the process by which emancipation happened. And so when the 13th Amendment was passed in some of the more rural parts of the South, it did take some time for news to travel and for enforcement by Northern troops to enforce the 13th Amendment. One such instance was news of the abolition of slavery reaching Texas. It happened there in, I believe, June 9th, I want to say, of 1865. And the holiday Juneteenth, which is a celebration of the abolition of Slavery, which Lincoln was shot in April. Celebration of the abolition of slavery is celebrated in June to kind of represent or show, well, not really to represent or show, but it does represent and shows that news of abolition did not always travel quickly. And, there it was June in Texas when news of abolition came, and some of the enslaved people in Texas were free as a result of that. Now, with this question of Reconstruction up in the air, again, what's going to happen? Leadership then passes to the vice president, who is Andrew Johnson. So now Andrew Johnson will be in charge. And Andrew Johnson has a certain plan for Reconstruction. We can either call it Johnson's plan. I'll just do that just to make it a little bit less confusing. Also sometimes called presidential Reconstruction, because he now is the president, vice president turned president. And this really throws things in a loop, because Andrew Johnson himself, although he is from humble origins, he's also from the South, right? He's from the South. And one of the reasons why Lincoln made him the vice president in 1864 was to try and show some unity between the North and the South. Andrew Johnson had worked his way up in the political elite, became a senator from Tennessee, but was unlike a lot of his contemporaries in that he wasn't from the planter elite, and he had a certain resentment of the very rich and powerful planter elite in the South. When the Civil War broke out, Andrew Johnson sided with the Union. He was, I believe, the only senator from a Confederate state that sided with the North, but he had emotional ties, you might say, with the South. He also believed in white supremacy. And those ideas that also sort of closely tied him with some of the former Confederate states. But with his head, with the logic, with the legal arguments, he said, no, the South should not secede, can't do it legally, and it's a bad idea. In the end, he was proven right in that respect. But now, really, for the process of Reconstruction, there essentially is, a Southerner now who is in the most powerful position in the United States. And, he's going to put forward a plan that in a lot of ways sort of resembles it. Maybe one good way of looking at Johnson is to say in some ways, his heart was really with the South, but, his head in terms of like, the legality of secession and how it would play out, he was, much more committed to the North. Now, Johnson followed Lincoln's plan of quick reincorporation. He definitely wanted to go the lenient path like Lincoln did. His proclamation of amnesty was pretty close. So we might say Johnson's plan was almost identical to Lincoln's, right? Very, very, very similar, except, and one exception here, was the planter class, right? Johnson excluded the planter class. So where initially Lincoln was really only concerned with these high-ranking Confederate leaders, saying that, for those people who played a role in the leadership of the Confederacy, they would be excluded from any future positions in the U.S. government. Johnson added on top of that the planter class, that is the very, very, very wealthy. And this was in line with Andrew Johnson's upbringing, from very from a much poorer background, but also his belief that it was the planter class that was responsible for the Civil War, that it was the rich that had gotten the South involved in the war, and it was a disaster for the South. However, during Johnson's, Reconstruction plan, as those states are being readmitted to the Union, many former Confederate leaders find themselves in positions of power once again. So we might say under Johnson, former Confederates rejoined the U.S. government. Among them was Alexander Stephens, who had been the former vice president of the Confederacy. He was, I'll just write this, Confederacy. He was the vice president, the second, highest ranking person, you could say, in the Confederate government. He was now running for and won, I believe, a seat in the House of Representatives from Georgia. And there were a lot of other people, too, who, just 6-7 years ago were, decrying the United States, threatening secession, then did secede, were considered by many of their other contemporaries from the North to be traitors. And here they are rejoining the government almost like nothing had ever happened. And there were members of the radical Republicans, specifically of the North, who saw Reconstruction under Johnson and began to use a saying, and that was the North won the war, but the South won the peace. That is, on the battlefield, the North won, but the process of Reconstruction as it stands under Andrew Johnson, it's almost as if, had you not known the outcome of the war and only saw, for example, members who were being reelected to positions of authority, it would almost be as if you would think the South would have won because, the North is not sort of getting what they want. And so the radical Republicans in Congress are going to act. They're not going to stand by and simply allow for the Alexander Stephens of the world to just simply re-enter the government as if nothing happened. Again, recall the radical Republicans, they want to work more to punish former Confederate leaders. And so really the story of Reconstruction in a lot of ways, at least just from a political element, right, just the politics of it, represents this division and this conflict between the radical Republicans on the one side and President Johnson on the other.